Great. So, well, thank you guys for coming, especially when you're sleep deprived or if you're, have had a long day, I'm sure, or in the middle of a meeting or whatever it is you've got going on. I know there's lots happening. So, but I was just going to give you sort of a plan for what I had tonight, and then we'll kind of go from there. But I wanted to give you guys time at the beginning just to share very briefly. It's not really meant to be a lot, but about somebody that you interacted with in your first year. For some of you, you had trouble thinking of your first year and an interaction with a student affairs professional, so you may have had to think further on in your career, or your experience was so different that you really didn't have that to speak of from firsthand experience, so you may talk about somebody else, which most people who had that situation reached out individually. So but anyways, that just gives us a chance to kind of get started. And then I've got just a few things I want to share, a few notes that I made to talk about tonight. And then I want to focus a little bit on some of the projects and see if you guys have questions. That's a lot to fit into in an hour. So, but the thing is, we have another class at 9, so we're really going to fit it into an hour. But I thought if you guys wouldn't mind, I'll let you guys kind of get us started. And Lena, you're actually my first person to the right, so I don't know if you're willing to start.
Sure.
Okay, but it would be you and then Tony would follow you.
Okay, so I was one of those people who had a really difficult time coming up with this because I started off in community college, and while I had a great experience and I got really involved in student leadership and involvement and stuff like that, I learned that community college was not great in the whole student affairs realm of like getting people in and like engaging with the students or helping them holistically develop. So I'm going to share a friend's, and theirs was they had an individual from disability services who helped them with their accommodations, and kind of from their first year to their last year, helped them in multiple ways and helped them navigate a lot of tough situations. She's hearing impaired, so she's got some struggles there. And the characteristics that she said that she noticed in this individual was complete compassion, in her words, and they were completely compassionate about what they were doing and helping her, and also honest. Like when situations were going wrong, the student affairs person was honest with why it was going wrong. So that was something that really stuck out.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I love that example because, I mean, we talk so much and you read so much about sense of belonging and the importance of helping students feel included. So I imagine being sort of set apart in that way made it even more difficult. And so having somebody that was an advocate, was there on your side, really helping you with that process was really important. So good. That's a great example. Thank you. Tony, are you willing to go next?
I am. So, like Lena, I had, well, not like her experience, but the commonality is I didn't have what's traditionally thought as a traditional undergrad experience. So, I literally was a 24-year-old freshman when I started working in my undergrad and at Messiah to begin with. So I literally was working mostly full time, and I would just commute to class and then I would leave. And then my only experience in college was the literal classes and like faculty and my advisor for a hot second, and that's it. So get in, get out, get it done. That was my kind of experience. So I actually talked to my wife, Cindy, who was a Messiah undergrad, and she was on campus as she was more traditional experience. And she particularly spoke of two workers who were in the student affairs realm, one being actually a counselor at the time at the Engel Center. And I think like just broadly, some of the things that she was kind of working on was sort of overarchingly identity, like figuring out who in the world she was. And that was like in the spiritual realm. Also, there's like, so she grew up in Mechanicsburg, close to Messiah, but still chose to live on campus. But dealing with like sort of not fully dependent on her parents as much and trying to figure out what does that look like. And then also even at that time, I think even like peers and like guy girl dynamics romantically and all that. So she was trying to figure out all those kind of things. And then even I think she was dealing with some kind of like like I said, identity, but self-concept, trying to have a healthy sense of that. So this Engel Center, this counselor person was one person. And then there was this residence life director that lived there. I think her name was Dottie. She kind of got to hang out with her a lot on campus, and that was the other person pretty impactful and meaningful to Cindy, my wife's college experience.
Oh, you just want an A, don't you?
That's funny.
No, it is funny because Cindy is one of our favorite people, his wife, and Tony. We like you too, but actually like your wife. She's pretty
You're stuck with me now.
So, something you actually pointed out that I don't even know if you really meant to do that was that you just wanted to get in and get out. And I think as we think about how demographics are changing on some campuses, like Messiah is really, really working toward getting more post-traditional students. They're going to want to get in and get out. And so they need accessibility and they need information just easily. They need that information quick and easy. And so as student affairs professionals, that's our role too. Like, what do our websites look like? How do we accommodate? Is it like, oh yeah, come in and sit down with me for 30 minutes and I'll get you this information you need. So I actually appreciate that you pointed that out, because I think that's something we have to keep in mind as we're thinking about future growth and how we work with our students. So great. Horatia, are you willing to go next? And then Funsho, you be after her. Great.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. So mine is Caleb Miller. And I actually forgot to reach out to you, but I really couldn't think of anyone my freshman year either, just because I went to class and went to my room. Like, that's all I did my freshman year. But stepping into sophomore year, I lived in Miller dorm, and I didn't really know anyone, didn't really interact with anyone in the student affairs side of things. I didn't even really know my RD the first year I was there at Messiah. So it was kind of a completely different experience my second year getting to know Caleb Miller, because from the moment I met him, during check-in, he was just very intentional about trying to learn my name, trying to learn things about me. And just seeing him around campus. He would stop, make conversation, ask questions, just about how I was doing, but then also trying to build that relationship, with my friends or just people I was sitting with if I saw them in the union or on my way to class. And I think just having that relationship with him just showed me that he made it apparent to the students he was connecting with, he cared about them as individuals. And then I wanted to study abroad that same year, so I went and did an interview with him, and just having that sit down conversation. It was cool to have personal one-on-one conversation with him, but also have academic related conversation as well, and just have someone who could be present in that same way. Just because I feel I have this conversation with people here at Lupton sometimes, just student affairs and academics are so separated sometimes, and we kind of separate ourselves into these two categories, and there's not a lot of that intermingling. So I think it's really cool I thought it was really cool, in looking back on my interactions with him, that he was very intentional about wanting to talk to me about how I was doing as a person and as a student, but then also how I was doing and how I wanted to explore my academic experiences as well. And so I just would definitely say he was that point person for me.
Well, you couldn't have picked a better example, because that sounds like he made a huge impact on you, and his intentionality was pretty obviously has influenced how you are an RD. I imagine that had a big influence. So I think that was actually a perfect example. Thanks. That's great.
All right. So I also had a tough time choosing someone from my first year. For undergrad, I went to 4 different schools. I started off in Georgia, made my way to Virginia, then I ended up in Maryland. And I couldn't think of a student affairs professional per se. The only person I could think of was one professor, Pamela Gerner, and she was a visiting professor at UMBC. And it was my senior year, the first semester of my senior year. I was enrolled in a cross-listed course. So it was Soc 497 / 658. And I was taking it to get a grad credit. And, all through undergrad, I'd been known as, a good writer and everything. And we had a project for that class where it was worth like at least 50% of your grade was hanging on that project. And I got a C on that assignment. And that crushed me. It was the first semester of my senior year. I'm trying to graduate and I got a C. And so I sent her an email at the end of everything, and I just kind of expressed like my sadness over this grade. And she was known to be a harsh professor, but she actually was very understanding. Not only did she give me another opportunity to work on that paper, but she explained to me, the reason why she wanted to make sure that I'm able to, not that I'm a bad student. She actually said something that stuck with me. She said, Funsho, I know you're a hard worker, but we want to make sure that you're a great student. And so basically that was something that, I took with me even as a professional and even now as a graduate student. It's something that like reiterates in my mind, like it's good to be a hard worker, but you can be a hard worker and just like, I guess like your work doesn't pay off unless like you actually understand what you're doing and then be intentional about like, what is your why? Something I learned from strategic planning. What is your why? Why are you doing what you're doing? And then kind of work towards that goal. So you're not just being a hard worker for nothing, but you're being a hard worker and you're achieving a certain goal. So that was one thing I learned from her and like I still carry with me today.
That's great. I love that like you took the initiative too to reach out to her, because some students just are sort of crippled and by fear of I don't know, maybe they're afraid of what the person will say, or maybe they just feel like it's not worth the sort of confrontation. But it reminds me too that oftentimes we think that student affairs partnerships with faculty are about actually physically partnering with faculty. And sometimes it's helping interpret for them as well. So I can't tell you how many students I had in my office when I was in residence life, service learning, University 101. And they would come and they would sit down and they would say, this happened. And then I would help them understand maybe where the faculty member was coming from, like offer a perspective that I don't think they had considered. And so it's almost like we can even just be a bridge, between students and faculty sometimes. So I actually appreciate that example because in your case, it's really great. You were able to take the initiative and reach out, and then it ended up being something that you learned a lot. You respected her, things like that. But there's a lot of students who just won't even do that. And they end up in your office because you're sort of a safe place, you don't maybe have the doctor title or there's just pieces that don't intimidate them about you. And so you end up being this bridge. And so I love that you sort of highlighted that piece because that's a good point, for us to all consider. So thank you. That's really great. Tova and then Carly.
Hey everyone. Sorry if I've been going in and out. I had a really bad connection, so I wound up switching to my phone. So I think we're okay now. The person that I picked is Tatiana Diaz. When I first started at Messiah, she was the director of multicultural at the time. She's since moved on to a different institution, but she was very helpful to me because my freshman year, I was super antisocial. I was trying to figure out who I was and who I was at Messiah, and I feel like she gave me the space to be myself in my freshman year, and I didn't even really know who that was, but she let me just talk to her and kind of work through things, figure things out. She was very approachable. That's characteristic, I would say. I felt like I could talk to her about pretty much anything, and she would listen. And I think listening is important because sometimes, and I catch myself when I'm helping students, sometimes you want to give them advice or tell them what they should do, but sometimes all they need is just a listening ear and to know that someone knows what's going on with them. So yeah, that was Tatiana. She was great. She left my junior year, and I was really sad. But
That's great. Well, and I imagine too, I'm sorry I keep saying all these things, but you guys are really hitting on some excellent points. And I don't even know if you're intentional about them or not, but I think about like students of color coming to a very, very like a predominantly white campus and having someone else there who gets like your experience maybe as you transition in, like how valuable that is. And we have to be reminded that we shouldn't just have points of connection just in multicultural programs or just in like certain areas where maybe we would expect maybe a person of color to work, but we really need to work to create more opportunities kind of across the board. Like that's the hill that we seem to need to die on. So, but I really appreciate like you talking about her warmth and all those kind of those things that you described, because I think that is extremely key in terms of relating to students and just like this sort of place that like a safe place, I guess, that people just feel like they can talk to you. And so it's funny because I've met some very like cut and dry people that their personalities aren't very warm. You know, they're more like business sort of mentality, but they can end up having the most meaningful conversations with students because not every student is cut from the same cloth, you know, and I think some students actually really appreciate different personality types and will gravitate toward a variety of people. So anyway, I just thought of that as you were saying that too. So thanks so much, Tova. That's great.
no problem.
Carly?
Yeah, so since we keep hitting on the whole safe space aspect, I'm going to talk about my one advisor, my professor, Dr. Watt. So freshman year, he's been my advisor for 4 years, but freshman year, I didn't really know him. He was always just like, my door's open if you ever want to talk. And I'm like, I'm okay. Like, I'm fine. Sophomore year rolled around, junior year rolled around when I took Greek, and I was like, Greek, why did I do this to myself? And so as time went on, the joke that Dr. Watt and I always had is my head above water? Is your head above water? And I would be like, no, my head is not above water. And he would be like, okay, let's go to my office. And his office would always be like that safe space to go to. It would always have words of encouragement and just things like that. And so Dr. Watt was like that. He was that. So he's mine. I wanted to hit on. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. And two, I think, because I've read some of the things that you've written about from your college experience. It was a very challenging time, you know. So having a point of like a safe space, having someone to talk to, I think that's really key. And I don't know if he ever recommended that you ever sit down with somebody like from the counseling center or anything like that, but I think that if we build trust with people, they can recommend that, and we say, hey, if he thinks it's a good idea, I might actually consider this.
Yeah, for sure.
So like there again, it's that bridge, that idea of being a bridge to resources. So that's great. Thank you so much. Did we get everybody? Oh no, Haley, you didn't go. Sorry, Haley.
It's okay. So I've talked about this person many, many times throughout my time at Messiah, but Jared Brown, my director of new student programs, and he was student leadership and involvement as well. He just created the sense of belonging with every student that he affected. But I met him, well, he was my advisor for my sorority, but also, involved on campus. And I really got to know him when I got back from winter break my freshman year. So during that first semester, I went to class, I came home, I ate, and then I went to sleep. It was so simple. I didn't really go out. I didn't really meet new people. And he really got me out of my shell. He believed in me and saw something that I didn't see. And really just challenged me to get out of my shell and create this leadership that he saw in me. And he really cared about the whole student. So their mental health, how they're doing academically, where they want to go in the future. And that's why I'm in this field, because he inspired me to be my best self, and I want to help students succeed. So, he was just dedicated and compassionate. He focused on strengths and tried to balance everybody's strengths together. And it was amazing. He's why I'm here today. So it was really, really inspiring.
That's really cool. And I think if we were to ask him, like, what did you do that made Haley respect you so much? He would probably just say, I don't know, it was myself.
He's like, nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
I think he's amazing. So
That's awesome. Yeah, you have written about him quite a bit, which I think is really neat. But I think we can't underestimate the impact of just being yourself too. You know, if you just allow yourself to like give the time to students that they need, we can be making a bigger impact than we could even imagine. So that's really neat. I'm glad that you had your experience where you were able to connect with him. That's neat while you're in college. Cool. Thank you so much. So now I'm trying to see if we got everybody, because I really don't want to leave anybody out. But oh no, Sierra. See, people keep popping up. I'm so sorry, Sierra, and you're about to fall asleep on me, and I just okay.
It's all good. So the person that I chose, who was really integral in my first year, was Miriam Nieves, who also worked in multicultural programs. So being part of the multicultural scholarship was huge in terms of like obviously like financially, but also like in terms of helping me understand my identity, because that wasn't something that like I grew up talking about. So having someone at Messiah that I could go to and kind of flesh that out a little bit was really key. And I always appreciated her willingness to listen and just really get feedback. And then also like her transparency and like her critical nature, and like asking me questions and like pushing me to think deeper about things that I may not have done before. So yeah, she was definitely there for me during that first year as I tried to figure out who I was at a place like Messiah.
That's awesome. I think we cannot underestimate our ability to help students with critical thinking. I think so many times we just assume it happens in the classroom, and people maybe read about a concept and then they think about it. But a lot of that processing, you were talking more about a personal experience, but a lot of processing, even of just ideas and concepts, for me, it was like a major faith crisis. I had faculty who were teaching these ideas that I had never been exposed to growing up, and they were like authority, so I didn't know how to make sense of a lot of that. It was my resident director, my RA, people that helped me sort of unpack it and talk about it that really made a huge impact on me personally. And so sometimes this idea of just being there for students, you know, being a listening ear, it has such a tremendous impact, and we cannot underestimate the value that has for students. So and I appreciate, even though yours was more of maybe like figuring out your identity and figuring out who you were, like that's a process as well. You know, it's not always just ideas and we're trying to make sense of what we're learning. It's like sort of this self concept, this understanding who you are. And if you're talking about holistic learning, which we've really kind of beat, and we've only are in week 2, but this idea of holistic learning, there's so much to process with all that. So anyway, so I appreciate you giving that example. That's really great. Thank you. So,
you muted yourself.
I didn't hear a word she said.
Did you hear any of what I said to Sierra? Are you kidding me?
No.
Oh no, that was so good too.
No,
this whole time you guys have been sitting there and have been talking.
No, we heard what you said to Sierra, but then like the last like 30 seconds, I did not hear what you said.
All right, that's great. Sorry about that. Okay, so all right, I just made a couple of notes. I've been thinking about even just where we are in the class. We're only, 2 weeks in. And last week we were talking quite a bit about these principles, this sort of like ideas that our profession is sort of built around. And in Higher Ed 515, we had in the strategic leadership class, we talked a lot about your personal leadership philosophy. You guys wrote one. You looked at maybe principles, characteristics, these ideals of leadership, and then you said, as a leader, this is what's important to me, this is what guides me, or this is where how I hope to sort of use this in the future in my work. And we didn't actually do that in this class, although it would have been really fantastic to sort of reconsider that. But in some senses, last week when we talked about these foundational documents, it was really looking at our philosophy collectively. It was saying, as educators, as student affairs professionals, this is what we ascribe to do, to be for students. And this is what's important, this idea of not just looking at their academic success, not just looking at making sure they're physically taken care of, but like emotionally, spiritually, this whole like holistic perspective. And, they talked a lot about inclusivity, inclusive practice. They talked about coherent values and ethical standards. And then, again, this like holistic approach to learning. They had lots more to say, but as I was thinking through this, this idea of, as a Christian, so as me as a Christian educator, I didn't just become a Christian educator when I came to Messiah 3.5 years ago. Like, I've always been a Christian educator, whether I was at the University of South Carolina, at Appalachian State University, at Messiah College. It looks differently because I'm sitting here talking very openly with you guys about this now, because that's really a kind of a component of how I teach. But as an educator, that's also very, very important to me, even if I'm in a secular setting. I think one of the beautiful things about a Christian college is it gives you that freedom to intentionally integrate those pieces. So, like an example, I was thinking about 2 students. One maybe goes to a big state school with a really strong engineering program. Another student goes to a Christian college like Messiah, again, studying engineering. And they are both involved in, like, the student that's at a big state school is doing like campus ministry. The student that's at Messiah is doing chapels and other student organizations that focus on service and outreach. But when you go to talk to them about how their engineering classes work out with what they feel called to as a Christian, a lot of times from a student who's been at a Christian college, they're going to talk about, well, I'm going to use my engineering in this way and this way and this way to sort of support my faith. Because like God has called me to do this, like this is who I was created to be. At a state school, they may or may not make that connection because they're not necessarily in classes hearing like engineering is designed this way and this is God's design, and this is how your vocation or your desire to serve fits with your academic curriculum. So sometimes as student affairs professionals, we have to help them to make those connections. When I was working in service learning, I had students coming in saying, I love service. I feel like it's so good to help people. It's so good that they didn't always make that connection, as that could really be your calling to serve people through whatever it is you're doing, accounting or social work or whatever it is. So sometimes I would ask them questions. Well, how does, like they would openly say to me, I'm a Christian, or this is part of who I am. And I would say, well, how does that sort of fit in with how you serve others? And so, in other words, I'm basically saying that, as I think about these standards of practice, if I am truly going to help develop students holistically, whether I'm at a Christian college like Messiah or I'm at a state school like South Carolina, I have to think about how do I help them integrate what they're, maybe learning through the classroom to their vocation, to what they're learning beyond the classroom, just how these things all play together. And I don't know if you guys had thought about that. So I just wanted to introduce this concept to sort of get your feedback as you think about these principles that we talked about in that first week, these ideas that sort of guide our profession, and how does that play in whether we're on a secular campus or a Christian campus. So you don't have to speak up, but if you have like a thought on that you'd like to share, I just thought I would open that up for a second. So.
I think that while it might look different because on a Christian campus, you'd be able to be very open about your faith. And I've learned at Messiah that it's almost expected to talk about your faith very openly versus a secular campus where you're not supposed to really dive too much into the Jesus talk. I think essentially, though, they should be the same. Like, they'll appear, like, they'll be presented differently, but ultimately the actions and the results should be unanimously the same across the board, regardless of the situation.
Agreed. And I think I should clarify too, I think this is like a solicited sort of atmosphere. This is where a student says, like, openly, this is like a piece of who I am. My Christian faith is who I am. In that case, versus like just going out and talking to any old Joe, you know. Do you know what I mean? Like, very different.
Well, then I think that even on a secular campus, if a student is saying, like, my Christian faith and trying to talk to us as student affairs people about their faith, we should still be supportive and still have that conversation, regardless of the fact that we're representing a secular institution.
Sure.
We're ultimately there to help the student develop, and if they're struggling with something and they're coming to us for help, they, I think, on a secular campus, first of all, know we're a safe space to go for that type of conversation. And also, they're comfortable enough with us to even try to have the conversation.
Sure.
So the reaction should be the same on both campuses at that point then.
I agree. I think when I was working on a secular campus, I felt like you had said, you're not really supposed to talk about those kinds of things. And I was so guarded sometimes that I didn't really open up as much as I wish sometimes I had, like reflecting back, especially and I wasn't even a student. Well, I was a graduate student, but it was very different. But I just remember feeling this sort of like desire to connect with people about my spirituality. And I just felt like that was not very often invited, you know? And so there was this piece of me that wasn't really being developed like I really wish that it had been in some senses. So anyways, that's where this sort of stems from, is how do we approach this work? If we're talking about holistic development and helping students kind of across all of their areas of growth, how does that look maybe in different environments? So I hear what you're saying, Lena, and I absolutely think you're right. We shouldn't really change who we are necessarily. But
I think I want to chime in very quickly. I completely understand, Dr. Weigel, where you're coming from, especially because I work at, a Big Ten, University of Maryland. And so it's hard to kind of integrate that part of myself when I'm dealing with students or even like amongst, colleagues. But one thing I know, when I first started working and it's even completely different now because I work in a different office. So I'm starting to get to know a whole new set of people. But I know that when I first started working in financial aid, what I did was in my office, I put, of course, I had my Bible, I had different kind of little itty bitty things in my office that kind of gave away that I'm a Christian. So I would be talking to certain students and I can tell that, most times they come in talking about financial aid, but then they just unwind and just start talking about how their classes are going and just different things. And some students will actually see my Bible or a quote, a Bible passage on the wall or something, and they'll be like, oh, you're a Christian? Oh, something. And then they'll start, like you said, they'll solicit that information or that advice, and then I'm free. But I feel and I guess I pose this question, for anyone to answer, how do you, incorporate your faith in a place or in an environment where, we talk about diversity and inclusion, but when it comes to actually speaking about your faith, it can be frowned upon. It can be taken as you're imposing your beliefs on someone else.
Great question.
I actually wanted to, or I was thinking about sort of piggybacking off of Dottie, what you and Lena were saying, and Lena brought up that it's really assumed at Messiah that there's a faith conversation with between students and student affairs folks. But I even wonder, like, is it so assumed that do students sometimes have like sort of plastic like responses, and like do they ever hide behind like, oh well, this is what people want me to say here at Messiah, it's a Christian institution. I've only worked at Messiah as far as higher ed goes, but I've worked in both secular and Christian other professional settings, and I found that, I mean, I was on staff at a church at one point. I worked in restaurants, and I've even felt like the subculture of restaurant people were some of the rawest, realest people, and like that was so. I found just like a transparency that sometimes even like the Christian context lacks. Um, so I think the initial approach might be a little more probing, asking just open-ended questions from student affairs worker point of view. But I mean, to kind of what Lane said, hopefully it can still get to the same space, the same spot, and then, like you said, Dottie, um, have a chance to develop the spiritual part of the holistic person as well.
And I just want to address the one question, and this might just be my opinion, but like the way I see it is that I don't necessarily like get on the soapbox and preach my faith, but I live my life according to it. And because I live my life so radically different from other people who don't have that faith, people see it and they get curious and ask me about it. So that does open the door. And I think that in the student affairs context, if we're living our faith, then students are going to be attracted to that if they want to know more. And it opens the door when they ask those questions.
Yeah, and I would agree that's ideal when you have a relationship with a student so they can see sort of the day in and day out. And then like Funsho was saying, sometimes she's just got them there, for that captured hour. And so how do you do it in a small sort of setting? Is it impossible? Is it possible? I liked your examples of you have tiny things that wouldn't be like in their face. Honestly, that to me is small enough that they would have to notice those things and say, hey, I see this is like, otherwise it could just be an inspirational quote, unless it says like King James Version or I don't know, like a clear indicator that it's a Bible verse or something like that. Those small sort of pieces. But I would absolutely agree, Lena, when you have a relationship with somebody or consistent where you interact with them on a regular basis, that's like one of the best ways, just having them see who you are like regularly. And so then you don't hide behind the sort of fake masks that Tony was talking about, or the students more in that case. But anyways, the authenticity I think is pretty key from what you're saying. Anybody else desire to chime in on this? Okay. Well, that just was on my mind, and that's a really hard thing to sort of, hey, let me just throw that out there in a weekly announcement. So I'm glad that you guys would give time to kind of have this conversation and look at that a little bit. But as you guys are thinking about some of the upcoming projects, I wanted to make sure that you feel good about some of what you'll be working on and see if you have any questions that have come up as you've been reading about the various projects that you'll be working on. Those being the conference presentation proposal, the student affairs professional informational interview, and then the functional area, both the paper and the presentation. So I don't know, it's helpful if I talk through them or if you guys just have any questions in general. Chances are somebody else has a similar question, so I thought I would just allow you guys if you had some initial.
I was actually hoping you could talk through the conference proposal.
Sure. So Absolutely. And this, again, is hypothetical, but with the idea that you can use it down the road. And so I think probably one of the best ways, if you are really struggling with an idea, maybe you just have an idea. Maybe there's something that you, in your office where you work or wherever you are, you have conversations where someone like, that would make a really good presentation at a conference. Maybe that's come up. I felt like that happened quite a bit when I was working in student affairs. People would say, we should present on that. I can't tell you how many times people said that. And then we're like, yeah, we'll get to that. We'll write a presentation proposal when we have time. Never. So this is essentially either if you have an idea, if you don't, you can look and Google like program handout. You can look back at like all of these bigger conferences. So maybe you have a topical area. Maybe you want to look broadly at student affairs like NASPA or ACPA. Those are both large organizations that have a lot of presentations that happen at their national or their annual conference. If you're more focused on the first year or on like, what is yours, Sierra? Is it NACAP or? Sorry, I'm making you.
NACAP.
Okay. So NACAP would be more admissions. So each kind of area, international students would be NAFSA, like NAFSA. So there's a lot of different organizations that will have the annual conference. And so you can Google the name of that and then maybe see if they have like an example of last year's program. It might be in a guidebook, which is an app, or it may be like just there on the internet. But starting to read through and see, wow, there are a lot of presentations on at-risk students, or there are a lot of presentations on like a certain topic, and you start to see those. And so maybe you say, well, that's something I'd be interested in writing about. But the idea is that you would first come up with your topic, and that might be the biggest challenge, honestly, is coming up with a topic, but you got to start somewhere. But then you basically are by going point by point through, there's like a template in there. And then I gave you an example of one that I submitted for the conference on the first year experience. So, but you take the topic, you get some background information, which should be pretty straightforward. It's just basically showing that literature supports this idea. And then maybe talk a little bit about what you would do in the presentation. You write like an abstract. There's like each of the sections you basically fill in. It's not a lot, but maybe what theoretical basis is this founded on, and so that could be, there's so many out there. Anyways, you put all these pieces together, and then what you do is you would submit it to NASPA, to ACPA, to NAFSA, to NACAP, or whatever organization it is for their conference. And they would say, this is a great idea, but you need to work on your proposal. So that's where I step in, because you're going to be submitting them to me. I'm going to give you feedback, and you're going to get it in a decent shape. So then you're going to say, you know what, I have an idea. Maybe I'll use this somewhere if I'm going to a conference or planning to. There's a lot of regional conferences that are very affordable. NASPA has region 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have so many regions, and they get basically schools in an area together. Lena was with us. And who else was there? We had, Emma and Trevor. And so we just went over to Philadelphia to Temple, and it was like $45 for the registration, and just went for the day. And it was so great because you get to hear from other people in the field. And one girl did a presentation on facilitating groups. That's what she did. Lena and I talked about reflection and trying to figure out where to go in your career in student affairs. So it can be very practical. It doesn't have to be extremely deep and a topic that's going to shake and move the world. But basically, anyway, you put all those pieces together and you'll submit it to the best of your ability. Please understand that I understand for most of you, it's your very first time. It's just to get you some confidence and give you like some feedback. And so that's really the purpose of this. with that said, like, I can tell when you didn't try. So you need to put effort into it, but you don't need to put expertise into it. Okay. If that makes any sense, you do need to give me your very best project or quality submission, but it doesn't have to like be perfect. So please don't put that pressure on yourself, because I'm not putting it on you. So don't put it on yourself. So does that help to explain a little bit about that? Okay. Any follow-up questions about the presentation proposal?
Yeah. So that conference proposal, is it just a proposal, or will we actually present on? Okay. So it's just like as if we were, but that's it. Just gathering the information, getting it organized, and as if it were to be.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I thought.
Yeah. It's just a practice. It's just an activity that I'm hoping you can actually use if you use it. To use it in the future. And it'll also I think the very first time I sat down to submit a conference presentation proposal, I was totally overwhelmed. I was like, I don't think I'm going to do this, And if you guys do this as a practice, an assignment, it's going to make you more confident to actually do it in the future. And so anyways, it's just really good to get this experience and then to go and see other people present best practices as well. So that's why it's so important. Anybody else have questions about the assignments or anything coming up? Okay. Well, you guys are easy peasy. If you change your mind in 2 days from now, you can send me an email. You can post on the general course questions, anything like that. Sometimes people will send me individual emails and I'll say, do you mind if I send this out as an announcement? This is a good question. Not that like Sierra had a question. I will say someone presented this question and it was a good one. So I want to make sure that the rest of you get the same answer. So anyway, so feel free to reach out and let me know if you do have another question that comes up later. All right. Well, thank you guys. And I hope you have a really good night and get some rest. And hopefully we'll see you all at some point very soon.
Thank you, Dottie.
You're welcome.
You, Dottie.
Bye, Dottie.
Dottie, bye, Dottie.
Bye.